He was 17 and he thought he knew the shape of winter. He had seen 4 of them on the Laramie Plains, and he had survived each one the way young men survive most things, by being too stubborn to notice how close he had come to dying. He believed, in the manner of boys who have not yet been broken by a thing larger than themselves, that cold was a matter of woolens and firewood and a strong back. He believed that a man who worked hard enough would not freeze. He believed that the old men who spoke of certain winters in lowered voices were exaggerating, or had grown soft, or were simply telling the kind of stories old men tell to keep the young in their place. His name was Caleb Wren, and in the autumn of 1886 he was sent by his widowed mother to live with his great-uncle on a quarter section of poor grass land 12 miles north of the Niobrara, in the western reach of the Nebraska Territory, where the wind came down off the Dakota high country with nothing standing between it and a man's bones but the man himself. The great-uncle was called Ezra Pell, and he was a thing the town of Bordeaux did not know what to do with. He was 71 years old that autumn, and he wore the same coat in every season, a long sheepskin garment so cracked and stained with use that it appeared to have grown from him, rather than been put on. He had one habit that no one in the county had ever made sense of. He carried at all times, in the right-hand pocket of that coat, a small iron rod about the length of a man's forearm, no thicker than a thumb, blackened at one end from some long ago fire. He took it out at odd hours and pressed the blackened tip against the ground, against the side of a tree, against the foundation of a building, and held it there as if listening. He had a phrase he said when he did this. He said, "The ground tells the air what to do." He had said it so often, over so many years, that the men in the town had stopped asking what it meant. They simply nodded and waited for him to leave so they could shake their heads and return to whatever they had been speaking of. Caleb arrived at the homestead in the second week of September with a single canvas bag, a letter from his mother, and a set of opinions about old men that he had not yet learned to keep to himself. Ezra met him at the wagon road in that sheepskin coat. He did not embrace the boy. He looked him over the way. A man looks over a tool he is considering buying, and he said only, "You'll do for digging." Then he turned and walked toward the cabin, and Caleb followed him, carrying his bag, and the wind came down off the high ground and ran a cold finger along the back of the boy's neck. And he did not yet understand that the finger was a question, and that he had been brought here to learn the answer. The cabin sat at the base of a long sloping hillside that ran up toward a wind-scored ridge. It was a small structure of cottonwood logs chinked with clay, set into the slope so that its north wall was nearly buried in the earth itself. There was a stovepipe and a single small window facing south, and a heavy plank door, and around the cabin nothing but grass, turning the color of old bread, and a few hardy plum bushes, hunched against the prevailing wind. There was a sod barn behind it for the 2 milk cows and the pair of mules. There was a root cellar dug into the hillside 30 yards east of the cabin, with a slanted door of weathered oak. And beyond the root cellar, running further into the hillside, there was something else. Caleb saw it on his second morning. He had risen at dawn to relieve himself, and he had walked east of the cabin, and there, beyond the root cellar door, in a stretch of hillside he had not paid attention to the day before, he saw the dark mouth of what looked like a mine shaft. It was a tunnel, neatly cut into the hill, framed at its entrance with heavy timbers, and shored along its visible length with more of the same. He could see perhaps 6 feet into it before the darkness took over. The opening was tall enough for a man to walk into without ducking, and wide enough that 2 men could have passed one another inside it. There was no door. There was no obvious purpose. He stood looking at it for a long moment in the gray light, and then he heard the old man step behind him. "That's our work for the season," Ezra said. Caleb turned. "What is it?" "A tunnel," Ezra said. "I can see that. Then you do not need me to tell you," Ezra said. And he turned and walked back toward the cabin, and that was the entirety of the explanation. Caleb received that morning. He stood at the mouth of the dark cut and felt the air coming out of it against his face. It was cooler than the morning air outside, and it smelled of earth and stone, and something he could not name. Something faintly sweet, like grain stored a long time in a dry place. He thought it was a strange smell for a hole in a hillside. He filed that away and went back to the cabin for his breakfast, which was cornmeal and salt pork and coffee black enough to stain a tin cup. And he ate it sitting across from a man who had told him almost nothing and seemed to feel no obligation to tell him more. He learned over the first 2 weeks the rhythm of the place. Ezra rose at the first gray hour. He fed the cows and the mules. He drank his coffee. He went to the tunnel. He worked there until the light was full, and then he came back and ate. And then he worked at smaller tasks until the noon meal. And then he went back to the tunnel and worked there until the light began to fail. Caleb worked beside him at the tunnel, and beside him at the smaller tasks, and across from him at the table, and he learned, in those first weeks, that Ezra Pell did not believe in conversation as other men understood it. He gave instructions. He answered direct questions, sometimes, with answers that raised more questions than they settled. He went days without saying anything that was not strictly necessary to the work at hand. The work at hand, in those first weeks, was the deepening of the tunnel. It already ran perhaps 15 feet into the hillside when Caleb arrived. Ezra meant to take it to 30. He had no engineer's plan, no diagram, no marked-out measurement on the ground. He had a length of knotted twine, with knots at intervals Caleb did not understand, and he had the iron rod from his coat pocket, and he had the boy. They dug with short-handled shovels and a heavy iron pick, and a wheelbarrow. Caleb had to maneuver up a narrow ramp of plank to dump the spoil onto a growing pile north of the cabin. The earth in the hillside was not pure clay and not pure sand, but a packed mixture of both, with stones the size of a man's fist scattered through it. It was hard digging. By the end of the third day, Caleb's hands had bled through 2 pairs of gloves, and his shoulders ached in a way they had never ached before. And he sat at the supper table and looked across at the old man, and said the thing he had been turning over in his mind all afternoon. "Uncle," he said, "why are we digging a tunnel?" Ezra spooned beans onto his plate. He did not look up. "Because the ground tells the air what to do," he said. "That isn't an answer. It is the only answer I have." "The men in town," Caleb said, "say you've been working at that hole for 6 years. Closer to 9, Ezra said. 9 years on a hole in a hillside. 9 years on a hole in a hillside, Ezra agreed. Why? Ezra set down his spoon. He looked at the boy then, and his eyes in the lamplight were the color of river ice, which is to say not blue and not gray, but the color of water that has decided to be something else. "Because one winter," he said, "the air is going to come down off the high country with a weight to it, and the houses in the valley will not hold. And when it does, the people in those houses will need somewhere to go. And I will have somewhere for them to go. A hole in a hillside. A hole in a hillside that is warmer than any house they have ever lived in." Caleb did not believe him. He believed the old man believed himself, which was a different thing. And he believed it with the kind of pity a young man feels for an old man whose mind he suspects has begun to wander. He said nothing more about it that night. He ate his beans, and he went to his bunk in the loft, and he listened to the wind moving along the ridge, and he thought about his mother, 12 miles south in Bordeaux, and about the year of his life he had been told to spend here, and he wondered if he could endure it. It was in the third week that he made the mistake he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He had ridden the mule into Bordeaux on a Saturday for flour and lamp oil, and a packet of needles his mother had asked Ezra to procure. He hitched the mule at the rail outside the general store of a man named Jessup, and he went inside, and Jessup was there behind his counter, and 3 other men were there in front of it, drinking coffee from tin cups and warming themselves at the small iron stove in the corner. They greeted Caleb the way men in small towns greet a boy they have known by sight but not by name. They asked after his mother. They asked how he was finding Ezra Pell. He was 17 and he wanted to be liked by men. He told them about the tunnel. He told them about the iron rod and the phrase about the ground, telling the air what to do. He shaped his hands in the air to describe the dark cut into the hillside, and he made his eyes wide the way a young man does when he is performing a story. And he said, "I don't know if he's gone soft or if he always was, but I am going to spend the winter helping a 71-year-old man dig a hole that goes nowhere." And the men laughed. They laughed easily and without cruelty, the way men laugh at things that are not their problem. And one of them, a freighter named Harlan Booth, who had known Ezra Pell for 30 years, said, "That old man has been digging that hole since before you were born, son, and he'll be digging it when they put him in one of his own." And the men laughed harder, and Caleb laughed with them, and Jessup wrapped his flour and his lamp oil and his needles. And Caleb rode the mule back 12 miles to the homestead, with a warm feeling in his chest that he mistook, that afternoon, for the feeling of belonging. He did not know that Ezra Pell had a cousin in Bordeaux who heard things in Jessup's store and remembered them. He did not know that within 3 days the laughter would come back to the old man's ears the way laughter always comes back to its source on the frontier. He did not know that for the rest of his life he would not think about that afternoon, and the easy way he had given away the only currency the old man had ever cared about, which was the right to be left alone with his work. A man named Pritchard rode out to the homestead on the following Tuesday on the pretense of asking about a stray heifer. He was the county's land agent, and he was 60 years old, and he had known Ezra Pell since both of them had been young men in the territory. He sat at the table and drank Ezra's coffee, and he made small conversation about the weather and the price of grass beef in Omaha. And then he said, almost as if it had just occurred to him, "Ezra, you know they're laughing at you again in town." "They have been laughing at me in town for 26 years, Ezra said. "This is different," Pritchard said. "They have something fresh to laugh about. The tunnel." The tunnel. Ezra was at the stove. He did not turn. "Then let them laugh, Ezra," Pritchard said. And his voice was not cruel. It was the voice of a man trying to do a kindness. "I have known you longer than most. You are not a fool, but a man your age, working at that hole, in the cold that is coming. It is not a thing a friend can watch and say nothing." "Then say something," Ezra said. "Sell me the quarter," Pritchard said. "Sell me the quarter and come into town and take a room above the smithy. You have earned a winter inside walls a man did not have to dig." Ezra set down the coffee pot. He turned and looked at Pritchard the way he had looked at Caleb that first afternoon at the wagon road, the way a man looks at a tool he is considering buying. "No," he said. Pritchard nodded slowly. He drank the rest of his coffee. He put on his hat. At the door, he said, "The boy will not stay if you do not give him a reason." "The reason will arrive," Ezra said. "It always does." Caleb had been in the loft during this conversation, mending a tear in his coat, and he had heard every word of it through the thin floor. He lay still after Pritchard rode away. He stared at the rough boards of the ceiling. He felt for the first time the small specific shame of having said a thing about a man who had given him a roof and food, and the only work that anyone had thought him fit for. He climbed down from the loft. He did not look at Ezra. He went out to the tunnel, and he picked up the pick and he worked until the light failed. And when he came back in, his shoulders shaking with the cold and the labor, the old man had a plate of beans warm on the table and said nothing about town, and nothing about Pritchard, and nothing about laughter. And Caleb understood that the silence was the only forgiveness he was going to be given, and that it was more than he deserved. The work, after that, took on a different character. He stopped asking why. He began to watch. He watched Ezra take the iron rod from his pocket and press its blackened tip against the wall of the tunnel at intervals of perhaps 4 feet, holding it there for a long moment, the way a doctor holds a stethoscope to a chest. He watched Ezra mark certain places on the tunnel wall with a stub of charcoal, a small cross, here and here and here, and then dig at those marked places a little deeper, carving small alcoves into the wall, each about the size of a man's head. He watched Ezra fill those alcoves, when the digging was done, with something he brought up by the bucket from a covered pile behind the sod barn. It was a mixture of fine ash from the cabin stove, dry chaff from the threshing of the previous summer's wheat, and sawdust the old man had been collecting in barrels for as long as anyone could remember. He packed the mixture into the alcoves and sealed them over with a paste of clay and water. When Caleb finally asked what he was doing, Ezra said, "The wall is too thin here." And when Caleb asked how he knew that, Ezra said, "The rod tells me." And when Caleb asked what the rod told him, Ezra said that the ground on the other side of this place will draw warmth out faster than the ground around it. So we give the wall a coat. Caleb did not understand. He did not understand for weeks. But he watched, and he noted the places that were marked, and he began to see a pattern. The places Ezra packed with ash and chaff and sawdust were always where the hillside above thinned out, or where a vein of stone ran near the surface, or where the slope of the ground above the tunnel changed in some way the boy could only barely see. He began to understand that the old man was not digging a tunnel. He was making a long room with walls of unequal thickness, and he was correcting the unequal thickness by packing the thin places with materials that held still air. Because still air, the boy was slowly coming to understand, was the warmest material a man could build with, if he knew how to keep it still. It was the iron rod that finally gave it up. One afternoon in the second week of October, with the first hard frost 3 days behind them, and the cottonwoods along the Niobrara going yellow, and then bare, Ezra handed Caleb the rod. "Put it against the wall there," he said. Hold it. Tell me what you feel. Caleb took the rod. It was cold in his hand. He held its blackened tip against the wall of the tunnel where Ezra pointed. He felt nothing for a long moment. He was about to say so. Then he felt it. A faint, almost imagined coolness traveling up the rod into his palm. He moved the rod 2 feet to the left, where Ezra had already packed an alcove. He held it there. The coolness was less. He moved it back to the bare wall. The coolness returned. The iron carries it, Ezra said. Cold travels through iron faster than through your skin. The rod tells you where the ground behind the wall is pulling. Where it pulls hardest, the wall is thinnest. Where the wall is thinnest, the still air must be packed. Who taught you that? A man named Goodnight, who learned it from a man named Eberhard, who learned it in the old country from his father, who built a wine cellar beneath a hill in a place called the Schwarzwald, Ezra said. They built rooms in the ground that did not freeze, and they kept wine in them, and the wine was good for 40 years. The principle is older than any of us. The iron rod is a small thing. It only tells you where the principle has not been honored. Caleb stood with the rod in his hand. He could feel, in the metal, the truth of what the old man had said. He could feel cold, traveling, faintly, from somewhere on the other side of the wall, through the rock and the earth and into the iron and into his palm. He understood, for the first time, that he had been wrong about the old man. He had been wrong about the hole. He had been wrong about the work. The wrongness sat in his chest like something he had swallowed that would not go down. That night at supper he said, "I am sorry," as Ezra was eating. He did not look up. For what? For what I said in town, Ezra chewed. He swallowed. He took a drink of water. He said, "A young man's tongue is a horse he has not yet learned to ride. You will learn or you will be thrown. There is nothing in between." It was the longest sentence he had spoken to Caleb in 3 weeks. They worked through the rest of October and into the first week of November. The tunnel reached its full 30 feet on a morning, when the wind was already carrying the metallic smell that meant a hard freeze was coming within the week. Ezra walked the length of the finished cut with a lantern. He pressed the iron rod against the walls one final time, at intervals, listening. He marked 4 last places. They packed them with the ash and chaff and sawdust. They sealed them with clay. Then Ezra began the second phase of the work. And it was here that Caleb came closest to ruining everything. The tunnel, finished, was 30 feet long, but Ezra did not intend it to be a single straight passage. He had Caleb help him build, 8 feet in from the entrance, a partition wall of cottonwood planks, fitted floor to ceiling, with a low door cut into the bottom, small enough that a man had to bend nearly double to pass through it. 6 feet beyond that, a second partition. 6 feet beyond that, a third, each with its own low, narrow door and each door offset from the one before it, so that no straight line of air could travel from the tunnel mouth to the far end. Why, Caleb said. Because air, Ezra said, is a lazy animal. It will travel in a straight line if you let it. If you make it turn, it will turn fewer times than you have asked it to. By the third turn, the cold air from outside has given up and lain down. The warm air in the back stays warm. 3 rooms. 4, Ezra said. The 4th is the back, the hearth room, a hearth in a tunnel, a small one, vented through a pipe that runs along the ceiling to a shaft I have already cut up through the hillside, 200 feet back from the tunnel mouth. The smoke will leave by that shaft. The warmth will stay. He showed Caleb the vent shaft. It was a thing Caleb had walked past for a month without noticing. A small stone-lined hole in the hillside above the tunnel, half hidden by a plum thicket, with a flat capstone Ezra could lift away when needed. The pipe that would carry the smoke ran along the back of the tunnel ceiling and disappeared up through the rock. It was an iron pipe. Ezra had set it himself, years ago, in mortar that had hardened around it like a held breath. Caleb stood in the back room of the tunnel and looked at the pipe and understood, finally, the scale of what the old man had done. 9 years. 9 years of digging, of packing, of fitting, of listening with the iron rod, of building a structure inside a hillside that no one in the county had bothered to understand, because they could only see the dark mouth of it from the outside. In the first week of November, they brought into the tunnel the things they meant to keep there. They brought a small cast-iron stove, the size of a milking stool, which Ezra had ordered from a foundry in Lincoln 6 years before and had been keeping under a canvas in the barn. They brought a length of stovepipe to connect it to the vent. They brought 4 wool blankets, 2 heavy oilcloth tarpaulins, a small barrel of cornmeal, 2 crocks of salt pork, a jar of dried apples, a tin of coffee, 6 pounds of beans, a sack of dried beef. They brought a lantern and a tin of kerosene. They brought a pair of axe heads and the long-handled shovel and a small saw. They brought, last, a Bible Ezra had not opened in 30 years, but did not feel right leaving in the cabin. They left the cabin stocked with all the ordinary things: flour, bacon, the rest of the cornmeal, the coffee. They left the cows and the mules in the sod barn with a month's worth of hay and a heavy stock of bedding straw. Ezra walked the perimeter of the homestead and looked at the sky and pressed his iron rod into the frozen ground in 3 places and stood listening. And Caleb watched him do it, and did not ask any more what he was listening for, because he had begun to feel that he could almost hear it himself on the night of November the 9th, with the wind beginning to lift in a way Caleb had not yet seen it lift. Ezra sat at the cabin table and drank his coffee and said, "I am going into Bordeaux tomorrow." Caleb looked up. "Tomorrow there is a man there who owes me money. I have let him owe it for 2 years. I want it before the snow. Uncle, the wind will not arrive until the 14th or the 15th. I have time. You are 71. I am aware of my age. Caleb, let me go. The man will not pay you. He will pay me because he has been avoiding me for 23 months, and he knows that when I have come this far, I will not leave without it. You will stay. You will watch the place. You will keep the stove in the cabin until I am back. And if I am not back by the 13th, you will move into the tunnel, and you will do the things I have shown you. Uncle, that is the arrangement." He rode out on the morning of November the 10th on the older of the 2 mules, with a satchel of cold biscuits and a canteen, and the iron rod in his coat pocket. He did not look back when he reached the wagon road. Caleb watched him from the doorway until he was a small shape against the brown grass, and then he was gone, and the boy went back inside the cabin, and the silence of the place was a thing he had not yet learned how to live with alone. The 11th was clear. The 12th was clear and cold. On the morning of the 13th, Caleb saddled the 2nd mule and rode 3 miles north along the ridge looking for any sign of his great-uncle returning. He saw nothing. The air had a metallic edge to it now, and the wind off the high country had begun to carry small, dry flakes of snow that did not stick but skittered along the ground like grains of sand. He turned back. By the time he reached the cabin, the flakes had grown larger, and the wind had risen, and a flat gray sheet had drawn across the sky from horizon to horizon. He understood then that the storm was not coming on the 14th or the 15th. It was coming that night. He understood something else in the same moment. His great-uncle was not going to make it back. He stood at the cabin door with the wind pulling at his coat, and he made a decision that he would, much later, recognize as the first decision he had ever made entirely on his own. He led the 2nd mule to the sod barn, and he stalled it with the cows, and he gave them all extra hay, and he banked the door behind him. He went into the cabin, and he banked the stove down, and he carried, in 3 trips through the rising wind, the last of the things he could think to bring: a small box of dry kindling, a tin of matches wrapped in oilcloth, a 2nd wool blanket, the cabin's iron skillet. Out to the tunnel mouth. He bent and passed through the low door of the 1st partition, then the 2nd, then the 3rd, and into the back room, where the small stove sat ready and the supplies were stacked. He lit the stove with hands that shook from cold and from something else. He sat down on a wool blanket in the orange light, and he listened to the wind, very far away now, beyond 3 partitions and 30 feet of earth, and he heard it as a distant murmur, the way a man in a deep well hears the sound of the world above him. He had his hand on the latch of the storage door 3 times that first night. It was on the 3rd partition, the one nearest the back room, that Ezra had built a small storage door at chest height, a narrow cabinet built into the partition wall itself, packed with sealed sacks of chaff. The chaff was insulation, Ezra had said. It must not be moved, but the storage door was the only place in the back room where Caleb could think to bring the mule, if the mule had to be brought in. He had been turning it over in his mind for hours. The sod barn was 30 yards from the tunnel mouth across open ground in a rising wind. If the wind became what he thought it might become, the mule and the cows would not survive in the barn. The mule, at least, he might save if he could get it down the tunnel. The cows were too large, but the mule he could fit, if he made room. And the only place to make room was the chest-height cabinet in the partition wall, packed with chaff, which Ezra had told him was insulation and must not be moved. He stood with his hand on the latch, and he thought about it for a long time. He thought about the warmth of the chaff and what it might mean, and he thought about the mule and what it might mean if the mule died, and he was alone for however long the storm lasted. He thought about being a boy who had made a wrong decision in a general store 6 weeks ago, and what it might mean to make a second wrong decision now. He stood there, and outside, beyond the 3 partitions, the wind was rising into something that did not yet have a name. He took his hand off the latch. He sat back down on the blanket. He thought about the mule, and he made his peace with whatever might happen to the mule. He fed the small stove a careful piece of kindling. He sat in the orange light, and he listened, and the wind rose, and at some point in the deep middle of the night it became a thing that had no relationship to any sound he had ever heard before. It was a low, sustained roar like a river the size of a county passing overhead. It was not a gust, it did not rise and fall. It simply began at some hour, and it did not stop. He felt it in the iron of the stove. He felt it in the rock walls of the back room. He felt it through the soles of his boots. The wind that had come down off the Dakota high country was not weather, in the sense the boy had understood weather to that point. It was a condition. It was a state the world had entered and could not be reasoned out of. He did not sleep that first night. He sat by the small stove, and he listened to the river of wind above him, and he thought about his great-uncle, somewhere on the road between Bordeaux and home, and he tried to make his mind hold the picture of an old man finding shelter, any shelter, and he could not make the picture stay. The picture kept turning, in his mind, into a picture of the sheepskin coat lying alone in a drift somewhere, with the iron rod still in its pocket, the rod that had told the old man for 9 years what the ground was doing and what the air would do because of it. He slept, finally, near dawn, and when he woke the stove had burned down, and the back room was cold, but not dangerously cold. And he understood as he opened his eyes that he could not hear the wind. He could feel it. He could feel it as a pressure in his ears, the way a man feels a deep drum struck in another room, but he could not hear it. The 3 partitions and the offset doors and the packed alcoves and the 30 feet of hillside had taken the sound of it and laid it down. He fed the stove. He boiled coffee. He ate a piece of dried beef and a hard biscuit. He sat with the coffee in his hands, and he made a small list in his head of the things he had to do that day, which were these: keep the stove burning, do not panic, do not leave the back room except to relieve himself in the 2nd partition, where Ezra had set a bucket for that purpose, and listen with what attention he had to the structure around him, for any sound that did not belong. It was on the 3rd day of the storm that he heard the first sound that did not belong. It was a thin, high creak somewhere in the 2nd partition. He went forward through the offset doors, bent nearly double in the narrow openings, and he stood in the 2nd partition with the lantern, and he listened. The sound came again. It came from the ceiling. He raised the lantern. He saw, at the joint where the partition wall met the rock of the tunnel ceiling, a thin line of moisture that had not been there before. Frost was forming along it. The frost was creeping very slowly along the joint toward the center of the partition. He did not know what it meant. He stood looking at it for a long time. Cold was coming through the joint. That much he understood. But why now, on the 3rd day, when the back room was holding warmth, and not on the 1st day, when the cold had been at its worst? It was then that he remembered what Ezra had said weeks before, almost in passing, about a thing called the 2nd cold. The 1st cold, the old man had said, is the cold of the air outside. It is loud and it is showy and it does not last. The 2nd cold is the cold of the ground after the air has been working on it for 2 or 3 days. The ground is slower than the air. The ground holds. When the ground turns, it turns for a long time, and it pulls warmth out of every place that touches it. The 2nd cold had arrived. The ground around the tunnel had been worked on by the wind and the snow for 3 days, and now the ground itself was beginning to draw the warmth out of the partition wall. Caleb stood in the lantern light, and he understood that one of the alcoves, somewhere on the other side of that joint, had not been packed thickly enough, or had settled, or had a thinness Ezra had not found with the iron rod. He understood that if he did not do something, the cold would creep through the night, from that joint into the partition itself, and from the partition into the back room, and the back room would no longer hold. He went to the back room. He took down a sack of chaff from the supply stack. There was extra. Ezra had left extra, and the boy understood now that the extra was for exactly this moment. He brought it forward. He climbed onto a small folding stool he had carried into the tunnel, and he reached up to the joint with a handful of chaff and a thumbprint of clay paste from a small crock Ezra had also left. And he packed the joint, working slowly and carefully, pushing the chaff into the crack with the back of a spoon, sealing it over with the clay, working his way along the joint for a full hour until the frost line was covered and the creeping had stopped. He climbed down. He stood looking at his work. He thought about all the times he had asked the old man why and all the times the old man had said something that sounded like nonsense. He thought about the iron rod. He thought about the alcoves. He thought, the wall is too thin here. And he heard the old man's voice when he thought it. He went back to the back room. He fed the stove. He sat down on the blanket and he wept, briefly, into his hands. For reasons he did not have words for and did not need to find words for. The storm lasted 9 days. He kept the small stove burning. He rationed the kindling. On the 5th day he took the long-handled shovel and crawled forward through the offset doors and pushed the door at the tunnel mouth open against a wall of packed snow and dug, for 2 hours, a small crawl space upward and outward through the drift until he reached open air. The air, when he reached it, was a thing he did not at first recognize as air. It was so cold that it burned the inside of his nose and made his eyes water, and the water freeze on his lashes. He looked out across what had been the homestead. He saw nothing he recognized. The cabin was a shape under the snow, and the sod barn was a shape under the snow, and the wagon road was gone, and the cottonwoods along the Niobrara were dark stripes in a white world that had no edges. He stood for a moment with his head above the drift, and then he went back down into the tunnel and packed the snow back into the crawl space behind him, leaving only a small breathing channel, because Ezra had said, weeks before, that any opening to the outside was a hole the cold would crawl through if you let it. He thought about his great-uncle then. He thought about the old man with the iron rod, somewhere out in that white world, or perhaps under it now. And he understood with a clarity that did not need to be spoken that Ezra Pell had known he would not be back. He understood that the trip to Bordeaux had been the old man's way of leaving the boy alone in the tunnel, because the tunnel would not hold 2 men as easily as it would hold one, and because there were 9 years of teaching that had not finished, and because the only way to finish them was to leave. He sat in the back room in the orange light, and he said, aloud, to no one, the ground tells the air what to do. And he understood it. He understood it the way a man understands a thing he has lived inside for 9 days. With the second cold pressing on every side of him, and the small stove burning, and the packed alcoves doing the work the old man had told them to do. On the 10th day the wind dropped. He felt it before he heard the silence. The pressure in his ears eased. He waited a full day before he believed it. On the morning of the 11th day, he crawled forward through the offset doors and dug out the tunnel mouth and walked out into a world that had been remade. The drifts were 6 feet high against the south wall of the cabin, and 10 feet high against the north. The sod barn was buried to its roof. He dug to the barn door for 3 hours, and when he reached it and got it open, he found the 2 cows alive, thin and weak and astonished to see him, and the second mule alive, and the air inside the barn was foul but warm, because the cows had kept each other warm, and the sod walls had held what the cows had given. He fed them and watered them from a bucket he filled with packed snow from the doorway. He stood in the warm dark of the barn, and he understood that the old man had built the sod barn the same way he had built the tunnel, with thicknesses and turnings, and that the boy had been living inside the old man's mind for 2 months and had only just begun to read its handwriting. It was on the 3rd day after the storm that the first of the townspeople came. They came on snowshoes from Bordeaux, 4 of them, led by the land agent Pritchard. They had come, Caleb understood as soon as he saw their faces, expecting to find a dead boy and a dead old man in a buried cabin. They had come to recover the bodies. Pritchard saw Caleb in the cabin doorway and stopped on the snow, and did not speak for a long moment. Then he came forward and embraced the boy as if the boy were his own son, which he was not, and Caleb understood, in that embrace, that the news of his survival was going to travel the county faster than any news the county had heard in years. They wanted to know about Ezra, he told them. Pritchard nodded slowly and said only, "We will find him in the spring." They wanted to know how the boy had survived. He showed them the tunnel. They walked the length of it, in lantern light, the 4 men in their snow-crusted coats, bending double through the offset doors, standing in the back room where the small stove still burned, looking at the packed alcoves and the partition walls and the vent shaft and the careful, patient work of 9 years of an old man's hands. They did not speak. Harlan Booth, the freighter who had laughed in the general store 6 weeks earlier, took off his hat and held it against his chest. Pritchard pressed his palm against the packed clay of an alcove and held it there a long moment, and then took it away and looked at his palm as if it had told him something. They came out of the tunnel into the gray winter daylight, and they stood looking at the dark mouth of it set into the hillside. And one of the men, a younger man Caleb did not know by name, said, "How long did he work at it?" 9 years, Caleb said. The men looked at one another. The man took off his own hat. Harlan Booth said, "I owe a debt I cannot pay." And Pritchard said, "We all do." They stayed the night in the cabin. They left in the morning with the news. Within a week, every family in Bordeaux and the country around it had heard the story. They came after that, in small groups. A father and his 2 sons, a widow and her daughter, a man with a fever in his lungs. They came not to see the tunnel, but to see the boy. They brought food they could not spare. They brought a wool coat for Caleb that had been the property of a man named Eberhard, who had died in the storm. A man whose name Caleb recognized because Ezra had said it to him once, weeks before, in the tunnel, holding the iron rod against the wall. The wool coat fit him. They found Ezra in the spring, as Pritchard had said they would. He had made it within 4 miles of the homestead before the storm took him. He had been sheltering, when he died, in the lee of a small outcrop of stone, with the sheepskin coat wrapped around him and the iron rod still in its pocket. The men brought the rod back to the boy. They buried Ezra on the south slope of the homestead, where the spring sun would reach him first. Caleb kept the rod. He carried it for the rest of his life in the right-hand pocket of his coat, the coat that had been Eberhardt's, and he took it out, at odd hours, and pressed its blackened tip against the ground, against the side of a tree, against the foundation of a building, and held it there as if listening. People who watched him do this asked him what he was doing. He did not always answer. When he did, he said only, "The ground tells the air what to do." They nodded and waited for him to leave. And he went on his way, and the iron rod stayed in his pocket, and the meaning of it stayed in him. And over the years a few young men came to him to ask if he would teach them, and to some of them he said yes. And to one of them, a thin boy from a thin farm north of the Niobrara, in the autumn of his own 71st year, he gave the rod itself, and the boy did not understand yet what he had been given, and Caleb did not explain, because the explaining was the wrong way to teach it. He stood at the door of his cabin and watched the boy walk down the wagon road with the rod in his pocket, and he thought about a Tuesday morning in November of 1886, when he had nearly opened the latch of a storage door, and a voice he had heard only in memory had stopped his hand. He thought about a man buried on a south slope, and the 9 years of work that man had done inside a hillside, and the way the work had outlived the worker, as good work always does. He thought about the first thing he had ever said to his great-uncle, and the last thing he had ever heard him say. He thought, the reason will arrive. It always does. He stood at the door for a long time. He nodded, once to himself, the way a man nods when he has finished a thought he has been carrying for a long time. Wisdom does not always arrive in time to be thanked, but it arrives if this story has settled into you the way the cold settles into a still room. The next one is already waiting at the edge of the firelight.